The jungle at Guadalcanal in August 1942 was supposed to be straightforward. 16,000 Marines land, secure an airfield. The enemy retreats or dies. That's how amphibious operations worked in theory. In practice, the enemy wasn't waiting on the beaches. The enemy was up 30, 40, sometimes 60 feet up in the canopy, tied to coconut palms with rope, invisible in vegetation so thick you couldn't see 5 feet into the green even in daylight. These were Japanese snipers, expert marksmen trained in a doctrine that transformed the jungle into a vertical killing field where death arrived without warning, almost without sound, and always from somewhere impossible to pinpoint. By the time Guadalcanal was secured in February 1943, Marine after-action reports documented something that would haunt Pacific commanders for the next 2 years. A single, well-positioned sniper could inflict more casualties than an entire enemy rifle squad. Let that settle for a moment. One man with a rifle killed more Marines than 12 men with rifles. The mathematics of modern combat were being rewritten in real time in terrain that had never been properly studied by American military planners, and the problem was going to get worse before anyone figured out how to fix it. On Bougainville, in November 1943, the 3rd Marine Division recorded combat casualty statistics that forced some uncomfortable conversations at higher command. An average of 15 combat deaths per day attributed to sniper fire alone. Not 15 wounded. 15 killed. Because Japanese snipers trained in the doctrine of the Now School understood something that Western military training had overlooked. The human body has critical anatomical targets that, when struck correctly, do not produce survivors for medical evacuation. They aimed for the head and upper chest. The wound patterns were so consistent, so precise, that Marine medical officers could identify sniper casualties before even examining the body. Their training manual, captured later at Saipan, was explicit. 1 shot, 1 kill, not as a motto, as doctrine. Japanese sniper training began in 1938 at the Now School, an institution dedicated entirely to marksmanship, fieldcraft, and psychological warfare. The selection process was rigorous. Recruits came from hunting backgrounds in rural Japan, or from families with centuries of martial tradition. They studied ballistics that would have impressed Western weapons designers. They practiced breath control with the precision of concert musicians. They were taught to exploit the human nervous system itself, understanding that a sniper's weapon was not just a rifle, it was the enemy's instinctive response to threat. When a Japanese sniper saw movement in foliage, when he identified what appeared to be a target, his training demanded immediate engagement. Hesitation wasn't patience. Hesitation was failure. It was doctrine carved into their nervous systems through thousands of hours of repetition. Here's what made this especially effective in the Pacific Theater. The terrain itself was a classroom for sniper employment that Japanese commanders had been hoping for. Coral atolls with elevation changes and clear sightlines. Jungle islands with triple canopy vegetation that created natural firing positions no engineering effort could replicate. Beach landings where Marines had to cross open ground before reaching cover. River crossings where men bunched together waiting to ford. Every geographic feature of the Pacific Island Campaign was optimized for a lethal opponent, with patience, ammunition, and training in the mechanics of human vulnerability. One specific incident at Cape Gloucester in December 1943 captures what Marine units were facing. A single sniper, one man, pinned down an entire rifle platoon. 43 Marines, unable to move, unable to do anything but huddle behind what little cover the jungle provided and wait. Every time someone shifted their weight, repositioned for a new angle, stood up for better visibility, a round would crack past their head or slam into the log they were hiding behind. The Marines fired thousands of rounds into the tree line, called in mortar strikes, even got a tank into position to blast suspected sniper locations. Nothing worked. The sniper would go silent for 20 minutes, let everyone think he'd been killed or displaced, then drop another Marine the moment they stood up. When they finally killed him, late that afternoon, a lucky machine gun burst that happened to saw through his perch, they found something that illustrated the problem. He'd only fired 18 rounds, and he'd killed 4 Marines and wounded 6 more. The psychological toll exceeded the body count. Marines began developing what military medical officers started calling sniper neurosis, right? A constant hunched posture. The inability to move naturally because every instinct screamed that standing upright meant death. This wasn't cowardice. This was a perfectly rational response to a persistent, lethal threat. But it made tactical movement impossible. You couldn't conduct proper defensive operations. You couldn't send runners between positions. You couldn't establish proper perimeters. Everything slowed to a crawl because one invisible man with a rifle had reduced your entire unit's combat effectiveness to almost nothing. The Japanese knew it too. Their field manuals, recovered after the war, made this calculation explicit. One skilled marksman was worth 10 regular infantrymen in jungle terrain. The mathematics were cold, brutal, and from a Japanese perspective, elegant. You don't need to manufacture ammunition for 10 soldiers and coordinate their actions if one trained sniper can achieve superior results alone. The supply logistics were simpler. The coordination challenge disappeared. One man in a tree was force multiplication incarnate. By mid-1943, Marine Corps intelligence had compiled a file 3 inches thick documenting Japanese sniper tactics, positions, and effectiveness across the Pacific Theater. What they didn't have was a solution. Standard counter-sniper doctrine wasn't working. The enemy had too much concealment, too much patience, and too much ammunition to waste on suppressive fire that never connected. Artillery wasn't reliable enough. Air support couldn't be everywhere. Individual marksmanship, which should have been symmetrical to sniper marksmanship, American sharpshooters against Japanese sharpshooters, wasn't the answer because the Japanese snipers positioned themselves in places American counter-snipers couldn't see or suppress. Something had to change. The casualty rates were unsustainable, and it would take an idea that came not from a military academy or a field manual, but from a man whose entire experience was watching people shoot at ducks in a carnival. Sergeant William Eldridge wasn't supposed to be innovating military tactics. He was supposed to be running a shooting gallery at the Nebraska State Fair. That was the family business. His grandfather had built it. His father had operated it through the 20s and 30s. Eldridge had grown up watching thousands of people approach a wooden counter with coins in their pockets and dreams of winning a stuffed animal. He knew their psychology with the precision that came from decades of observation. He knew exactly when they'd pull the trigger. He knew what would make them keep pulling the trigger even after they knew the targets were mechanical, that they couldn't really win. He understood something about human behavior under stress that military psychologists hadn't found yet. When your training says shoot, when your reflexes say shoot, you shoot. Consciousness doesn't get a vote. Then Pearl Harbor happened, and in March 1942, Eldridge walked into a recruiting office in Lincoln, Nebraska with skills that seemed utterly worthless for modern warfare. 20 years of experience watching people shoot at moving ducks, understanding the exact moments when shooters would commit to the trigger, recognizing that shooters, all shooters, regardless of their nationality or training, always took the bait when it was presented correctly. His platoon mates at Camp Pendleton thought he was strange. Not dangerous strange, carnival strange, the guy who'd seen too many ring tosses and couldn't stop analyzing human behavior like everything was a midway game. While other Marines obsessed over fieldcraft and fire discipline and marksmanship drills, Eldridge kept muttering about trigger timing and visual commitment. His squad leader finally told him to shut up about the carnival, unless he wanted to peel potatoes until the war ended. So Eldridge shut up about it, mostly, but he didn't stop watching, didn't stop noticing, didn't stop thinking about how the patterns he'd observed in Nebraska seemed to apply everywhere, even in a combat zone. Bougainville, November 1943, third day of the campaign. Eldridge's company was trying to advance down a trail that a Japanese sniper had turned into a personal hunting preserve. 6 Marines down in 90 minutes. Nobody could spot the shooter. The company commander was running out of options. Standard procedure said, call for artillery, suppress the area, wait him out. But Eldridge was watching the bullet impacts, tracking angles, suddenly not seeing a sniper anymore. He was seeing something else entirely. He was seeing that kid from Omaha who used to come to the fair every year, the one who'd empty his pockets trying to knock down metal rabbits. Same behavior, same psychology, same exploitable pattern. He told his lieutenant he had an idea. The lieutenant told him to get back in line. Eldridge persisted, said he needed a helmet, a stick, and 2 minutes. The lieutenant, exhausted, desperate, and at his wits' end, gave him 30 seconds to explain before threatening him with insubordination charges. What Eldridge said next sounded so ridiculous that 2 nearby Marines started laughing. Sir, we make him waste his bullets shooting at nothing, just like the shooting gallery. Wave a helmet, he shoots. We see where he shoots from, we kill him. Simple. The lieutenant's response was immediate and profane. You don't trick snipers, Eldridge. You suppress them with firepower or outflank them with maneuver. This isn't a carnival game. This is combat, and combat has rules, doctrine, procedures written by people who actually understand warfare. Eldridge didn't back down. He pointed out that they'd already fired 3,000 rounds at that sniper without effect, called in 2 mortar strikes that hit nothing but trees, lost 6 men doing things by the book. His way would cost 1 helmet and maybe some ammunition. The book's way was costing lives, and just then a wounded radio man was being carried past on a stretcher. 17 years old, shot through the jaw because he'd stood up for 2 seconds to adjust his antenna. The lieutenant looked at that kid, looked at Eldridge, and said 5 words that would echo through the rest of the Pacific War. Fine. Don't get yourself killed. Eldridge grabbed his helmet, found a sturdy branch about 5 feet long, and jammed the helmet onto one end. His squad thought they were watching a man commit elaborate suicide. The other platoon thought he'd had some kind of psychological breakdown. The company commander, watching from 50 yards back, reached for his binoculars with the weary certainty that he was about to witness the stupidest death of the campaign. Nobody, not one single Marine on that trail, thought Eldridge's carnival trick would actually work. Eldridge knelt behind a fallen log, extended the helmet on the stick about 3 feet above the cover line, and waved it slowly like a man moving through underbrush with caution. The sound that came next was the sound every Marine had learned to recognize, the distinctive crack of a Type 97 rifle, sharp and clean even through dense jungle. The helmet jerked as the round punched clean through the steel, and suddenly Marines who'd been preparing to rush in and get Eldridge's body started paying very close attention. The sniper had taken the bait. The question was why and whether he'd do it again. Japanese sniper training at the Now School emphasized something their instructors called ichi ichi hatsu. 1 target, 1 shot. The doctrine wasn't about conserving ammunition. It was about maintaining psychological dominance. A sniper who saw an enemy helmet moving through vegetation and didn't fire was a sniper who allowed that enemy to advance, to establish position, potentially to spot the sniper's location. The field manual captured later at Saipan was explicit. Delay equals detection equals death. When you see the target, you shoot. Hesitation wasn't tactical patience, it was failure. But here's what Eldridge's carnival experience gave him, an understanding of how human visual systems work under stress. When a helmet appears above cover, moving at roughly 2 miles per hour, the speed of a careful combat advance, the brain processes it as threat helmet shoot in a cascade that takes approximately 6 seconds. That's the time it takes for visual information to travel from the eye through the occipital lobe to the motor cortex and down to the trigger finger. 6 seconds where the conscious mind isn't really involved. It's pure trained reflex. At the carnival, Eldridge had watched thousands of people shoot at mechanical ducks moving on tracks. The good shooters hit maybe 70%, the bad ones hit 30%. But everyone, and he meant everyone, took multiple shots even when they knew the ducks were fake. It wasn't about being fooled. It was about neurological commitment. Once your brain said target and your finger started pulling the trigger, stopping that sequence required conscious override. And conscious thought was always slower than reflex. Eldridge waved the helmet again. Different angle, different height, another crack, another hole. The sniper was committed now, locked into a behavioral loop that his training had hardwired into his nervous system. Target visible equals fire weapon. Each shot took roughly 4 seconds to cycle. Work the bolt, acquire sight picture, control breathing, squeeze trigger. 4 seconds where the sniper's conscious mind could theoretically intervene and say, wait, this might be a decoy. But 4 seconds wasn't enough time. The motion looked right. The silhouette looked right. And that doctrinal imperative, shoot or allow enemy advance, overrode skepticism every single time. A Marine marksman named Corporal James Henshaw was counting the shots and tracking the muzzle flashes. By the 3rd shot, he had the sniper triangulated, 40 feet up in a coconut palm about 80 yards northeast, hidden in a cluster of fronds. The 4th shot confirmed it. A tiny flash. Barely. Visible. But there. Henshaw settled his Springfield Eero 3 rifle. He did what he'd been trained to do at Quantico, controlled his breathing with the precision of someone who understood that conscious control trumps panic. He sent 170 grains of copper-jacketed lead through the space where that flash had originated. The subsequent silence lasted about 10 seconds before someone started laughing. Then everyone was laughing. that slightly hysterical combat laughter that comes when you realize something impossibly stupid just worked. Eldridge lowered his stick, examined the helmet with its two neat holes, and said the most Eldridge thing possible. "Told you!" Just like the ducks, word travels fast in a combat zone, especially when that word involves not dying. Within 48 hours, every rifle company in the 3rd Marine Division had heard about the Nebraska sergeant who'd turned sniper hunting into a puppet show. Some officers dismissed it as a lucky fluke, a one-time success that couldn't be replicated. Others wanted to see it themselves. Others understood immediately what they were seeing, a tactical innovation that weaponized something the Japanese snipers couldn't defend against, their own doctrine against them. The company commander, a captain from Virginia who'd lost 11 men to snipers in just 2 weeks, decided Eldridge was going to give a demonstration whether he wanted to or not. The opportunity came at Tarawa in November 1943 during what would become the bloodiest 76 hours of Pacific combat up to that point. Marines hit the beaches on November 20th, expecting heavy resistance at the water's edge. What they got was that, plus something worse, Japanese snipers, who'd survived the naval bombardment and were methodically picking off anyone who thought they'd secured an area. The 2nd Marine Division's casualty reports from day one showed 38 confirmed sniper kills, a number that made conventional counter-sniper operations look completely inadequate. Eldridge's squad got tasked with clearing a Japanese strongpoint on day 2, a cluster of damaged bunkers where at least 3 snipers had established interlocking fields of fire. Standard assault doctrine would have meant calling in air support, probably losing a dozen Marines in the approach and hoping you caught the snipers in the blast radius. Instead, their platoon leader, now a believer after Bougainville, gave Eldridge the green light to try his carnival routine with proper support. They set up 4 helmet stations at different points around the strongpoint, each one manned by a Marine with a stick and absolute faith that he was about to become a bullet magnet. The plan was coordinated. Wave the helmets in sequence, create multiple targets, force the snipers to reveal themselves through muzzle flash and impact patterns. Behind each helmet operator, a Marine counter-sniper with an 03 Springfield and a scope waited for something to shoot at that wasn't a decoy. The operation started at 0830 hours and turned into something approaching a masterclass in behavioral exploitation. First helmet goes up, crack, bullet, flash, spotted. Second helmet, crack, different angle, second sniper identified. Third helmet, crack, third sniper confirmed. The Japanese marksmen couldn't help themselves. Their training, their doctrine, their entire tactical framework demanded they engage visible targets immediately. 4 Marines waving helmets on sticks had just turned 3 lethal snipers into predictable stimulus response machines. Over the next 2 hours, those 4 helmets drew 47 separate shots from Japanese positions. 47 times a sniper saw what looked like a Marine head and pulled his trigger and accomplished nothing except revealing his location. The Marine counter-snipers kept careful count. First sniper eliminated at 0845, second at 0920, third at 0953. Then things got interesting because the helmet trick had attracted snipers from adjacent positions who heard the firing and wanted to participate in what they thought was a target-rich environment. By 10:30 hours, Marine marksmen had confirmed 11 Japanese snipers killed, all drawn in by the decoys, all eliminated by shooters who'd never have spotted them without the helmet trick, forcing them to give away their positions. The cost to the Marines? 4 helmets with multiple holes, some sore arms from holding sticks for 2 hours, and 0 casualties. 0. In an operation that conventional doctrine suggested would cost at least 8 to 10 killed and twice that wounded, Eldridge's carnival game had achieved complete tactical success without losing a single Marine. The battalion commander showed up personally to watch the last hour. He didn't say much, just stood there with his arms crossed, watching helmets bob on sticks while his snipers dropped Japanese marksmen one by one. When it was over, he looked at Eldridge and asked one question: "Can you teach this?" Eldridge could teach it, but what he really taught the Marine Corps was something Japanese logistics officers had been quietly worrying about since Guadalcanal: ammunition arithmetic. Every Japanese sniper deployed to the Pacific carried 120 rounds in 6 stripper clips of 20 rounds each. That sounds like plenty until you understand something fundamental. This ammunition had to last for the entire duration of their deployment. On fortified islands, that meant weeks or even months. Japanese supply doctrine assumed 15 rounds expended per day maximum. That meant an 8-day supply if they were disciplined. The helmet trick could burn through 50 rounds in an afternoon. Marine intelligence first documented this ammunition constraint in January 1944 when they overran a sniper position on New Britain and found a dead Japanese marksman with only 7 rounds remaining in his pouch. Tucked next to the ammunition was a handwritten note in Japanese. Aya, captured Korean laborer, translated it. 17 days, no resupply. Conserve ammunition or die useless. That note made its way up to division intelligence, and suddenly people started doing math that should have been obvious from the beginning. Japanese logistics in the Pacific were terrible. Supply lines were getting shredded by submarines. Island garrisons were isolated, surrounded, cut off. A sniper who wasted 47 rounds shooting at decoys wasn't just ineffective, he was operationally finished. Think about the numbers. If a Japanese sniper started his deployment with 120 rounds and Marines ran 4 helmet decoys for 2 hours, conservatively drawing 12 shots per decoy, that's 48 rounds expended, 40% of his total ammunition, gone in one morning shooting at helmets on sticks. Now he's got 72 rounds left. But he's already behind the resupply curve because his commanders assumed he'd only use 30 rounds in 2 days. He just used 48 in 2 hours, and there's no resupply coming. The submarines have seen to that. What happened next was a psychological transformation that Marine forward observers started noticing by February 1944. Japanese snipers were becoming hesitant, not smart hesitant, where they waited for better shots. Panicked hesitant, where they couldn't pull the trigger, even on legitimate targets, because they were terrified of running out of ammunition. Marines advancing through areas that should have been sniper country reported enemy marksmen letting obvious targets pass. One patrol on New Bougainville reported a Japanese sniper who let 7 Marines walk past his position before finally shooting at the 8th. He missed, and immediately displaced, a violation of every principle in his training manual. Captured Japanese after-action reports from units not completely annihilated confirmed what the Marines were seeing. One document from Guadalcanal described sniper squads rendered combat ineffective by enemy deception tactics, requiring excessive ammunition expenditure. Another from Saipan reported snipers abandoning positions after expending 70 rounds with negligible enemy casualties achieved. These weren't combat losses. These weren't snipers killed or wounded. These were snipers still alive, but functionally useless because they'd been tricked into emptying their pouches, shooting at nothing. The helmet trick had weaponized scarcity. Japanese doctrine assumed their snipers were shooting at real targets, achieving real kills, justifying every round expended. But when 40% of those rounds punched through empty helmets, the entire tactical framework collapsed. A sniper with 20 rounds left wasn't a threat multiplier anymore. He was a regular rifleman who happened to be stuck in a tree with no way to meaningfully affect the battle. He'd gone from hunter to witness, watching Marines advance while he conserved his last magazine for some desperate final stand that probably wouldn't matter anyway. Marine casualty reports started reflecting the shift immediately. Confirmed sniper kills per battalion dropped from averages of 12 per day in late 1943 to 7 per day by April 1944 in comparable island assaults. Same terrain, same enemy doctrine, same training. The only thing that changed was that snipers were being systematically starved of ammunition through a carnival trick that cost the Marines nothing but helmets. The real test of any tactic isn't whether it works once under ideal conditions. It's whether it scales across different terrain, different enemy units, and different tactical situations. The helmet trick got tested across every major island campaign from early 1944 through February 1945. And the data that emerged told a story that even the skeptics at Marine headquarters couldn't dismiss. Between Tarawa in November 1943 and Iwo Jima in February 1945, Marine casualties attributed to sniper fire dropped by 38%, despite fighting in terrain that should have made sniping more effective, not less. The statistics were stark enough to force institutional attention. At Tarawa, the 2nd Marine Division recorded 114 confirmed sniper casualties over 76 hours. That's roughly 1.5 Marines killed or wounded per hour of combat operations. At Saipan in June 1944, 7 months after helmet decoy doctrine became standard, the same division in comparable jungle terrain recorded 68 sniper casualties over 3 weeks. The raw numbers looked similar until you factored in operational tempo. Saipan involved 15 times more combat hours, which meant the per-hour sniper casualty rate had dropped to 0.04 from 1.5. Same division, same enemy, completely different outcome. Paliliu in September 1944 provided even more compelling evidence because the terrain was sniper paradise. Coral ridges, countless caves, elevation advantages, firing positions that covered multiple approaches. Japanese commanders had specifically selected sniper positions during their months of defensive preparation, creating interlocking fields of fire that should have made Marine advances catastrophically expensive. Instead, 1st Marine Division after-action reports documented a pattern that kept repeating. Helmet decoys deployed, Japanese snipers engaged, counter-snipers eliminated threats, advances continued with minimal casualties. One rifle company logged 43 separate helmet decoy operations over 8 days. Drew an estimated 300 Japanese shots, suffered only 2 sniper casualties during that period. 2. In 8 days of sustained combat in terrain designed for snipers, the Japanese knew what was happening to them. Captured documents from Saipan included a tactical memorandum dated July 2, 1944, from a Japanese infantry colonel to his remaining sniper teams. A Marine translator flagged it as significant. The translation reads, "Enemy employs false targets to waste ammunition and reveal positions. Sniper teams must exercise fire discipline and verify targets before engagement." The memo then listed specific recognition factors: check for neck shadow, verify arm movement, confirm natural gait patterns. It was a desperate attempt to counter-program the reflexive target engagement that Japanese doctrine had spent years drilling into their snipers' nervous systems. The problem was that conscious verification takes time, and time in combat gets you killed. A sniper who paused 3 seconds to verify whether that helmet was real or fake was a sniper who let actual Marines advance 3 seconds closer to his position. Japanese field commanders were trapped between 2 bad options: shoot reflexively and waste ammunition on decoys, or hesitate and allow enemy advances. The Marines had weaponized that dilemma. There wasn't a good doctrinal answer. There wasn't an answer at all. By February 1945 at Iwo Jima, captured Japanese position maps told the final story. Marine intelligence recovered planning documents from a destroyed command bunker that showed sniper positions color-coded by ammunition status. Red positions indicated critical ammunition shortage. The map showed 43 sniper positions total. 37 were red. The annotations repeated the same phrase over and over: enemy deception, consuming excessive ammunition, resupply impossible, position effectiveness degraded. These weren't positions that had been overrun or destroyed. These were positions still occupied by living Japanese snipers who'd been reduced to tactical irrelevance because they'd shot at too many helmets. The cumulative strategic impact is impossible to quantify precisely, but division medical officers made educated estimates. If sniper casualty rates had remained at Tarawa levels through Iwo Jima, the Marine Corps would have suffered an additional 4,000 sniper-related casualties across the island campaigns. 4,000 Marines who came home instead of dying to an invisible enemy, all because one carnival worker understood that shooters always take the bait. The Marine Corps doesn't usually adopt tactics invented by carnival workers, especially when those tactics sound like something a desperate platoon made up 5 minutes before getting overrun. Military institutions run on doctrine, field manuals, and training procedures developed by people with academy credentials and staff college diplomas. But by January 1944, the casualty numbers from the Pacific were forcing some uncomfortable admissions at headquarters. Traditional counter-sniper operations weren't working. Eldridge's helmet trick was. The formal standardization process started in February 1944 at Camp Pendleton, where Marine Corps schools convened a working group on counter-sniper tactics. They brought in Eldridge, now sporting a Bronze Star he thought was ridiculous, and asked him to demonstrate his technique to a room full of skeptical officers who'd spent their entire careers studying warfare through the lens of established military theory. What those officers saw was a Nebraska sergeant waving a helmet on a stick while explaining sight picture acquisition and trigger psychology using carnival terminology that wasn't in any field manual. Half the room thought it was embarrassing. The other half understood immediately that they were watching something that might save lives. The compromise was typical military bureaucracy. They'd adopt the tactic, but dress it up in proper doctrinal language. The official training manual, released in March 1944, called it Decoy-Initiated Counter-Sniper Protocol, instead of Eldridge's helmet trick. The equipment list specified expendable helmet mounted on portable extension device instead of helmet on a stick. But the actual content was pure carnival logic translated into military speak. Present, realistic target silhouette, employ irregular movement patterns, maintain operator concealment, which meant wave the helmet, don't stand where the helmet is, and try not to look stupid while doing it. What made the doctrine actually effective wasn't the manual, it was the refinements that came from Marines who took Eldridge's basic concept and started experimenting. A corporal from Iowa added weight to the helmet interior so it bobbed more naturally when moved. A private from Texas discovered that dragging the helmet slowly across an opening drew more shots than waving it. A sergeant from Louisiana figured out that if you paused the helmet for 3 seconds, then moved it suddenly, snipers would fire reflexively at the motion. Within 2 months, rifle companies were developing their own variations, each one exploiting some aspect of human visual response and trigger psychology. The training program became surprisingly sophisticated. By April 1944, every Marine rifle company in the Pacific Theater received a 2-hour block of instruction on helmet decoy operations. They practiced on bamboo poles cut to precise 5-foot lengths, short enough to control, long enough to keep your head away from the helmet. They learned choreographed movement patterns: slow wave, pause, quick bob, diagonal sweep. The instructors, many of them combat veterans who'd seen the technique work, taught timing and rhythm like they were teaching dance steps. Move too predictably, and smart snipers might catch on. Move too erratically, and you don't trigger their engagement reflex. The sweet spot was human natural, the irregular rhythm of a real Marine moving carefully through hostile terrain. Some units added theatrical elements that would have made Eldridge proud. They put lieutenants' bars on some helmets to make them priority targets. They attached fabric strips to simulate camouflage covers fluttering in wind. One creative company on Peleliu started adding fake radio antennas made from bent wire, banking on Japanese doctrine that prioritized killing. Communications personnel. The Japanese kept shooting. The Marines kept counting, and the body count kept shifting in the right direction. By June 1944, what had started as one sergeant's ridiculous idea had become standard operating procedure across the entire Marine Corps Pacific Command. The official after-action reviews were careful to credit systematic doctrinal development in the Pacific Theater rather than a carnival worker from Nebraska. But every Marine who'd actually done it knew the truth. The real innovators were the ones who recognized that enemy doctrine, however effective in theory, had a vulnerability when it collided with human psychology. The Marine Corps kept using helmet decoy tactics through Korea and into Vietnam, with modifications for different terrain and enemy doctrine. The basic principles stayed the same: exploit the opponent's training and reflexes against them using cheap decoys that cost nothing and saved lives. Various field manuals over the decades credited the technique to systematic doctrinal development without mentioning that it came from a carnival worker who thought the whole thing was obvious. That's how institutions work. They take innovations, run them through committees, dress them in appropriate terminology, and present them as the product of expert analysis. Sometimes that's a necessary process. Sometimes it's just how bureaucracy functions. Eldridge made it through Okinawa in spring 1945, which statistically shouldn't have happened. The 10th Army suffered over 65,000 casualties during 82 days of fighting, making it the bloodiest campaign of the Pacific War. Eldridge's company took 68% casualties, which meant he watched most of the men he'd trained and fought alongside get killed or evacuated. He spent those final months of combat doing what he'd been doing since Bougainville, waving helmets on sticks, teaching new replacements the carnival tricks, trying not to think about how something that seemed so obvious to him had somehow become revolutionary military doctrine. When the war ended in August 1945, Eldridge was a staff sergeant with a Bronze Star, 2 Purple Hearts from wounds he barely remembered getting, and a service record that mentioned his innovative tactical contributions to counter-sniper operations. He got processed out at Camp Pendleton in October, received his discharge papers, and took a bus back to Lincoln, Nebraska. His father picked him up at the station, asked how the war was, and Eldridge said what almost every combat veteran says: "Fine. It was fine. Let's talk about something else." The shooting gallery was still there on the fairgrounds. Same mechanical ducks running on the same tracks. Same bell that rang when you hit the target. Eldridge stepped back into running it like he'd never left, except now he had this weird habit of watching people's trigger discipline and muttering about sight picture acquisition. Customers thought he'd gotten particular about his carnival game. He'd actually spent 3 years watching the same behavioral patterns get men killed or keep them alive, depending on which side understood them better. The truth about innovation in warfare isn't that it comes from the most educated or the most experienced in academic terms. Sometimes it comes from someone who understands human nature in ways that formal training doesn't teach. Someone who watched enough people make the same decisions under pressure that they could predict it. Someone who understood that the reflexive response, pull the trigger when you see a target, is harder to override than conscious thought, no matter how much training you have. Eldridge died in 1987 at age 71. His obituary in the Lincoln Journal-Star mentioned his Marine Corps service in one sentence and spent 3 paragraphs talking about how he'd been a fixture at the state fair for 50 years. Nobody mentioned that his carnival trick had saved thousands of lives. Nobody mentioned that he'd turned Japanese sniper doctrine inside out using principles he'd learned watching people shoot at mechanical ducks. He probably would have preferred it that way. Common sense doesn't need monuments. It just needs to work. And in the Pacific Islands of 1943 and 1944, when young Marines faced an enemy they couldn't see, but who was exceptionally good at seeing them, Eldridge's carnival trick worked. It worked precisely because he understood something fundamental about human behavior that military institutions are still struggling with today. People act according to their training. And if you understand their training well enough, you can predict exactly how they'll respond. You can turn their greatest strength into their greatest vulnerability. You can beat them by thinking like them, understanding them better than they understand themselves. That's the real lesson from the helmet trick. Not that carnival workers make good soldiers, but that wisdom isn't always measured by credentials. Sometimes it's measured by whether you keep your eyes open and your mind curious, whether you notice patterns nobody else sees, whether you understand that human beings, all of us, regardless of our training or nationality or experience, share certain behaviors that are almost impossible to overcome once they're hardwired into our nervous systems. The Japanese snipers at Bougainville and Tarawa and Peleliu and Saipan weren't stupid. They weren't poorly trained. They were constrained by something more powerful than intelligence. Doctrine that had worked so well, it became truth. And the moment that truth collided with something it wasn't designed to handle, a carnival worker's understanding of how people actually behave under stress, it shattered. That's a story worth remembering, not just as military history, but as a reminder that sometimes the most effective solution to a problem comes not from the experts in the room, but from someone on the outside who sees what everyone else is too close to notice. If you found this documentary interesting, if you want to keep learning the hidden stories of the Pacific War that shaped modern combat, please drop a like and subscribe. We're uncoding history one forgotten story at a time.